Welcome to the Thinklings podcast, a conversation where good thoughts help renew the mind with the Word of God. I'm Charlie Carter, and I'm here with Tim Little and Andy Stearns. Let's jump into the conversation. Welcome to the Thinklings podcast.
It's like we're back to normal.
Haven't we learned our lesson about sound effects?
Sorry about that.
In this episode, we are going to talk about singleness. And there's only one of us here that is single, so I guess it's just going to be me talking the whole time, right?
Sounds good.
Actually, no. Tim read a book about the 7 myths of singleness, and so he's going to talk about that, and I'm going to give color commentary. So anyway, but before that, how are we doing?
Oh, not too bad. Not too bad.
What's going on?
I ran out of podcast content this week.
What?
Yeah, I was like for listening, my own self.
Oh.
So I caught up on our episodes and then all the shows I caught up on. So anyways, I was looking around and Iowa Regular Baptist Camp has a podcast feed and it's just all the camp speakers. So anyways, I hopped on there and I'd like to give a shout out to Cody Huber. So he spoke, this is, I don't know, a couple weeks back. Was it junior high? Do you know? I think it was junior high.
He's at junior high.
He was at junior high. And I saw Cody and he's been a student of mine. And I was like, oh, I'll listen to his talk. And so I just went to his last one and it was really good, listeners. So it was interesting. He was talking about when he was in high school, he hated school and he didn't want to try. But then when he got a car, he was threatened to lose the car if he didn't keep his grades up. And he said, I immediately got on the honor roll. And his point was he was going to Romans 8, I think. I didn't get all the way through it. He said, when you love something, there's a byproduct. Okay, you have an affection for something and that produces byproducts in your life. And he says, I loved my freedom. I loved my car. I loved being able to go places. And that created the byproduct of I was willing to do hard things and obey so I could have the thing I wanted. And then he transitions, junior hires, you need the proper affections in your life. Mm-hmm. If you don't have those, there's going to be byproducts in your life. And so loving God needs to be the one affection that drives everything. And then that produces obedience. And I thought he got the order right. And it was just ministering to my soul. So anyways, a little shout out to Cody.
You mean that there are certain affections that are proper?
Yes.
And ordered, certain affections that aren't proper?
Possibly. Maybe even the ones that are disordered or out of order might even be called maybe passions. So.
Ooh.
I should actually, hold on. If we're talking Cody, I got to tell a story. So in Greek class, he picked, maybe I shouldn't tell this story.
What, his Hebrew or his Greek name?
His Greek name.
I'm pretty sure I remember
He picked the word in Greek that would be translated in 3 different ways commonly. That or since or because.
Oh,
so,
dear.
So Charlie, what's that Greek word?
Hati.
Yes, hati. And he did it so that every time he asked a question, I would call on him and say, yes, hati, or I'd say hati. And then he'd be, well, thank you. And it was like I was complimenting him. What a punk. So after I gave him a shout out, I guess I just made fun of him. But anyways, it was nourishing to my soul. He has different affections. So what was that thing about
proper affections?
Well, he has different ones now. He's grown. Oh, okay. He's a work in progress like all of us. He's growing. It's good.
Hey, you know what? As someone whose Greek and Hebrew name was very important to them, you know.
I know. I mean, let's not talk Greek names, Charlie.
A sweet smelling aroma. Anyway.
Of an office, maybe?
So we have some Thinklings business to tend to.
Books and business.
Let's talk about that book, Tim.
7 Myths About Singleness by Sam Alberry. I've been working on a paper, and singleness and marriage is connected to it, particularly the complexities of marriage and how it makes a person's life just more complex. And that's one of the advantages of singleness is the lack of complexity. And Alberry hits on that. But the 7 myths, I guess maybe I'll start by just reading through them all. Singleness is too hard. Number 2, singleness requires a special calling. 3, singleness means no intimacy. Singleness means no family. Singleness hinders ministry. Singleness wastes your sexuality. And singleness is easy. So those are his 7 myths. So in the Singleness is Too Hard section, he kind of goes through Matthew 19, particularly the section where Jesus, Jesus takes a very high view of divorce, to which the disciples then respond, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. And they're like, man, it's like better not to marry. And so he kind of expounds upon that, and he's like, oh, wow, man, a proper view of marriage should actually cause unmarried people to consider more seriously what they're agreeing to. And that was actually a good input there. And so that's kind of what I had right there. His big emphasis that he does make throughout is that singleness has the advantage of alleviating an individual from the worldly troubles that encumber a married couple. That is Paul's point in 1 Corinthians 7:28. He brings that point up on multiple different occasions, and justly so. He brings it up on page 28 and 29. I think that might be the first time that he brings it up, but I remember him mentioning that point at multiple times. His section on singleness requires a special calling. That one kind of, and people talk about like the gift of singleness, and I wasn't necessarily convinced of his singleness requires a special calling. What he was trying to do basically is to destigmatize the whole idea of singleness. For example, he lists out several problems with this way of thinking. For his first one is, it is ultimately another way of denying the intrinsic goodness of singleness. It's like, oh, you have a special calling, so that it's not good in some way. I didn't really buy that one as much. It didn't seem too compelling to me. His second one, it encourages bitterness rather than the pursuit of godly contentment. So it's like, oh man, I'm stuck with this godly calling, or this calling to singleness. And so it can kind of foster a type of bitterness in an individual. Number three, it unwittingly permits disobedience. So like, what if certain singles are convinced they don't have the gift of singleness, yet find themselves in a situation where the only opportunities for a romantic relationship involve sin? So Alberry is also interacting with people with same-sex desire, and so it could unwittingly permit disobedience, is his third point. Number four, it's hard to see why someone should not apply the same logic to marriage. That was his same point. And that's where, again, like in 1 Corinthians 7, it presents, well, somebody has like a gift, or if you want to call a calling, a gift to singleness, well, a gift or a calling to marriage.
Yeah.
And so
interesting.
It's not, I don't see really a distinction between these two things. If God has called you to a life of singleness, will you use that gift, that calling, for the glory of God? If God has given you the gift, the calling of marriage, then you use that gift, that calling, to the glory of God. So this whole section on the singleness requires a special calling, I didn't really find that compelling.
Can I ask you a question?
Go for it.
Is he saying that he thinks singleness requires a special calling, or is he saying he doesn't like it when people say that? I was having a hard time following. He's saying it's not a special calling?
It's not a special calling.
Okay, thank you. That, I just want to confirm. Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. I see it more as a special calling.
You do?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So just from reading 1 Corinthians 7, my interpretation there, Martin Luther is kind of interesting going back in time and seeing his perspective with all of the monks and the nuns. And I recently read The Estate of Marriage by Martin Luther. He says some wild things in there, but
dude, he says a lot of wild things.
Yeah,
he said some good stuff, man.
Yeah, he had some good stuff.
When he's in left field, it's
left field,
Lutheran left field.
Yeah.
Like weird.
Yeah. So, but one of his points was most people need to marry. That's what he was. But if you look back in his world and what he was doing, he was going into these Catholic monks and nunneries and basically marrying everybody off because they were living in sexual sin. Mm-hmm. And so he's like, you know what? Everybody needs to just go get married. There are very few people that have this special calling, this gift of singleness. So if you want a different perspective, you can read The Estate of Marriage by Martin Luther.
So can I just, for the listeners, you're looking at 1 Corinthians 7:7, where Paul says, I wish that all were as I am myself, and he was unmarried at the time. And then it says, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind, one of another. So you would say right there, he's talking about whether you're married or unmarried, and he's calling it a gift.
Right.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. I see what you're saying.
Singleness is a gift.
Marriage is a gift.
Is a gift.
Okay. Okay.
So like,
huh.
In the same, so like, would you put that in the same category as like, we speak of like someone's called to be a pastor?
Or just a providential calling in that God has called an individual to a life of singleness.
Yeah. And I don't know. I think we could go down this road quite a bit, because I kind of like the idea that either you are this one or this one. It's not like you have like a special anointing, like you are now specially empowered to be single person. It's like you are single.
So that idea is actually one of the ideas he interacts with someplace in the book about how singleness seems to be some superhero ability. Like,
well, it's that chapter, isn't it?
It may be that chapter. I had some other dog-eared pages on this, and but he does reference that idea.
And I think so. I kind of like his balance where he's, I'm not sure I can. I've never really been convinced exegetically of like, look, singleness is a special gift or empowering. It's like the person who's not married.
So it's funny. Ooh, sorry,
like
I'm really
God
close.
doesn't specially anoint people to then be content in marriage. They get married. You know what I mean? Like trying to like mysticize or spiritualize, like now that you're married, you have this extra thing because you're married and to be married. Like special calling, gifting set type of that language can be, I understand what I think he's trying to do there, but I don't know. We could talk more about that.
So the normal wisdom order of creation, God gave reproductive organs to individuals for the purpose of reproducing, and that's done within the bounds of Christian marriage. And so that's the normal calling, gifting for most people. So this would be a special gifting or calling for specific individuals that is usually connected to some specific ministry or task which God has laid before that individual. So I would see it along those lines.
So this is funny. I was just, I'm looking at 1 Corinthians 7:7, and it says each has his own gift. And I thought, I'll look up the word gift in Greek, see what word that is. Do you guys know?
It's like charis, isn't it?
It's charisma. It's not charis, it's charisma. And so look it up, and definition 1 is the earthly goods bestowed by God. So like things that you're given, like that you need. But then it's the second definition, special gifts of a non-material sort bestowed through God's generosity on individual Christians. You have the gift of carrying out special tasks mediated by the laying on of hands in 1 Timothy 4:14 and 2 Timothy 1:6, of the power to be content in sexual matters, 1 Corinthians 7:7, of spiritual gifts in a special sense, and then it looks at the gift lists of Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 12. That's really interesting that like all of those would be, I don't know how to say it, like situational.
Yeah.
Like what you're saying. Like, hey, you get married, now, you're gifted for this.
So if you are that's the one where he cites this passage. Yeah. So I think what Tim, you are advocating for is that there is a unique gift for someone who's meant to be single.
Yes.
So then there's a category of people that are currently single who are not to remain single because they don't have that gift.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people that are...
And that would be what the author here is trying to remove. Is like
he doesn't like that.
Yeah, okay.
Gotcha, okay. Sorry, I know that was a rabbit trail, but I thought that was helpful to think that, to clarify.
Hopefully it's just a single rabbit trail.
Never mind. I'm not saying anything else. Tim, keep talking about your book.
Okay, so...
Hopefully it's a single
Hopefully? That's... 2 points,
So
one
that's
for
myth number
each
2.
rabbit ear. That was good.
So 2 problems arise if we continue to think about singleness as being a special kind of calling. First, it will make large numbers of single people feel as though life hasn't started yet.
We read that last part one more.
It will make large numbers of single people feel as if life hasn't started yet. It's like, I'm not married. I'm supposed to marry.
Okay.
My life hasn't begun yet.
Gotcha.
Okay, so that's a feeling that could materialize. Now, I would just push back and just be like, no, I don't think that needs to be the case. If that person feels that way, then they need to realize that this season of life is something that God has given them where they can use even their temporary singleness for the glory of God.
Yeah, the sovereignty of God would infusing this whole discussion with providence and the sovereignty of God really would help it out.
So he states they're single, but don't perceive themselves as having the gift of singleness. So they're in like this limbo state. So number 2, second, it can lead to undue pressure to get married, especially for those single people not perceived to have that gift. If you're single and don't have the gift of singleness, then you're not pulling your weight. You should be married by now. So there's like this undue pressure to get married. So then this launches into a very interesting quote. One prominent Christian leader recently made the following remarks about singleness. I'm going to read this. Let me tell you, the most devastating attack on marriage today is coming from singleness. Singleness is an assault on marriage. Marriage is the grace of life. As a pastor, I tell my people, look, if it keeps going this way, I'm going to line all the girls on one side, all the guys on the other. We're going to just match you up and have a huge wedding.
Wait. Can we try to guess who said that?
Yeah, who?
Doug Wilson?
No.
That sounds like Doug Wilson. Charlie, you got a guess?
No.
It's John MacArthur.
Oh my word.
That's fantastic.
Well, okay, look, if there's anyone who's going to say it like that's not okay. That's not surprising. I just figured that was like the post-mill.
That seems like
live,
a
laugh,
really strange fire coming from him.
live, laugh, feast kind of,
You're funny.
or fight, feast, laugh, whatever it is.
Oh, I'm going to finish the quote. This escalating this is an important part of his quote of what MacArthur states. This escalating self-preoccupation, personal ambition, personal development that creates a kind of terminal singleness is devastating on obviously the family. I just see singleness as a disaster.
Oh, that. Do you think that's fair? I think
it is fair.
That's the side of singleness where like you are self-consumed, you're living for yourself, and it's not a gift of God, it's selfishness.
Right. Now, Alberry does not like this at all. So then he states, the speaker is expressing a godly concern, albeit in very poorly chosen language. Many people today are delaying marriage for entirely selfish reasons.
Okay.
And so what he wants to do is say, listen, the problem that singles are single is because they're selfish and they need to deal with their selfishness. And then he goes on and talks about that. The underlying problem is not with singleness, but with selfishness. He states that specifically on page 45. I completely agree. But here's what would be maybe a very practical way that a person that is selfish could deal with their selfishness, particularly if they are of marriageable age and maybe even very well beyond marriageable age. What's a very practical thing that they could perhaps do to work through this sin of selfishness?
I don't know.
Get married. If you're like, you know what, I'm going to humble myself and I am going to marry this individual and serve them and love this woman as Christ loved the church. And that would be an act of selfishness.
Yep.
To covenant to do so.
So if you had that mindset, that would be true. The problem
is those guys don't.
No. Well, I'm going to say the problem is there are many selfish married people. So that's to say marriage, I would say that just getting married to solve the selfishness problem would never work. You have to see it and humble yourself. So I would agree with that. But I would say if I knew two people who were utterly selfish and said, you guys should get married so you become less selfish, that's not. It could be an occasion God could use very effectively. But again, it comes down to humbling yourself. # Charlie's discipleship book.
So singleness requires a special calling. That was chapter 2. Chapter 3, singleness means no intimacy. So a couple of the chapters he talks about, this one and the next one, singleness means no family. Basically, he's talking about how you still have relationships and you have friendships as a single individual. In fact, sometimes those relationships are much deeper. He quotes Lewis. The least natural of loves, the least instinctive, organic, biological, gregarious, and necessary, the species biologically considered has no need of it. Friendship.
Yes.
Okay.
That's good.
And that was a quote from Lewis in his book. So,
Quoting the Four Loves.
Yeah, it was. It was a quote of the Four Loves. So singleness means no family is the next chapter. I'm dealing with these two basically together. This chapter I kind of had mixed feelings about, but at the beginning I didn't really care for it because I didn't like how he was symbolizing the family. But really, as I read through it, there's a ton of metaphor in the Old and New Testament, particularly the New Testament, that the church is a family. And so I really think it is, he convinced me it is a valid analogy. Singleness means no family. No, you do have a family. Your family is the church of God.
Amen.
And that's where your relationship is. That's where you're pouring your life into. And so he makes a very strong case there. He deals with hospitality in this chapter. He quotes Rosaria Butterfield and what genuine hospitality is. And he has a lot of really good illustrations of church people who have been hospitable to him. Some people just give him a key to their house, and he has a place where he can stay at any time. And it was a good chapter. Okay, and then singleness hinders ministry. He had a very even approach to this. I thought this chapter again was very good. This gets into kind of the article that you were writing on, Charlie. So he deals specifically why don't any churches hire single pastors? And he had a very even explanation and gave several different reasons why churches aren't interested in a single pastor. His one section is specifically stated, do pastors have to be married? And he states, no, they don't. But can single pastors serve married people? And they can, but it's going to be different. So anyway, I thought that was still a really good chapter. Then chapter 6, he talks about singleness wastes your sexuality. And this chapter, he's really highlighting on how sexuality is something that's temporal. And too often within our culture, sexuality is not viewed as something so momentary. But God designed our bodies as sexual bodies. But in the eschaton, that is not a component of our expression. So he had one statement in here that was particularly good. For a lot of this chapter, I didn't really care for how allegorized he made sexuality. I'm just like, wastes your sexuality.
Can we pause for just a moment?
Go ahead.
Has he ever commented on the Song of Solomon? Do you know like what his interpretation on the song would be?
Oh, no, not at all.
Not necessarily here, but just in general. Like if in this chapter, if he's like really allegorizing like sexual desire, I would just be really curious to see what he does.
If he took a literal interpretation.
I would love to see what he does with the song. But
our marriages are therefore temporal and momentary on page 119.
Which is true.
It is true. And as married individuals, we need to remember that in the eschaton, people are not married or given in marriage. We are individuals serving our Lord. And then on page 120, this I thought had a really nice punch to it. Singleness for us now is also a way of, like Jesus, we can live in a way that anticipates what is to come. Singleness now is a way of saying that this future reality is so certain and so good that we can embrace it now. It is a way of declaring to a world obsessed with sexual and romantic intimacy that these things are not ultimate and that in Christ we possess what is.
Wow. Amen.
I thought that was an awesome
That is
point.
really good.
Say, you know what? I'm not stuck being single. I'm not. It's like I am single because I'm living in anticipation of the day when everybody is single. And just a smack in the face of our sex and romantic saturated culture, and just say that is not that important.
Wow.
So I really liked that quote on page 120. And but still, he has that in the section, singleness wastes your sexuality. It's just like, well, okay, that's kind of an interesting twist. He's not wasting his sexuality. He's showing the proper place of sexuality in the ordering of Christian affections by denying himself it.
Mm-hmm. But in our culture today, saying it that way would probably be proper. Because today, what is the singular thing, pun intended, that most people are living for in that time of life and actually in our culture? In fact, that's the thing that our culture would say is worth wrecking a marriage over. So that you can be fulfilled. So, and that's quality. Well, I mean, that's pushing back against the wave of culture.
Right? Why would God give someone a desire if he didn't want them to act on it? I mean, have you ever heard someone tell you that? Like, I know this is God's will. Why would God let me have the desire? Why would he put that desire in my heart if he didn't want me to do that?
Man, having a confusion about how God leads and thinking that God leads through your desires is one of those handicaps that not only handicaps you, but it blinds you to the problem.
It's like when you let your heart take the place of your head.
I know. Oh, man.
Wow.
Man, this is good.
Okay, so the last chapter is Singleness is Easy. And in this chapter, I didn't like it. It's basically going through all of the different areas that singles struggle with. Like, I'm never going to have any children. I'm never going to have somebody to come home to at night. I'm never going to So he basically is trying to connect with the fears and challenges of singles, but it felt instead like a pity party. Or, I mean, he didn't intend it that way, but I recognized what he was trying to do, but it felt too much for me. Like it created, instead of the God focus, it's just like the weight of all of the burdens that singles have to bear here in this world. And so it left me more with a burden instead of the freedom in Christ that a lot of the other book gave. So that's just my perception of it.
I don't want to, and I think I don't have to be careful, but I know some singles, and I would say that they would probably resonate with that chapter. Yes. And I also know married people who stupidly, and I'll say it that way, look at singles and think, man, it's so much easier for you because they're so self-absorbed and they haven't stopped to think like, what kind of struggles and difficulties do you go through? So I wonder if that chapter is more of like a bridge for people who don't understand singleness. Do you think that could be how it was meant? Or is it still like, because I just think there are married people who have no clue how hard it is for single people. And they look at them down their nose and think, why aren't you married? Man, your life must be so easy. And they say things like that to them. And then that single goes home feeling horrible and just really struggling. They would want this, or it's really hard, or they're alone when they come home. I could see that chapter being very helpful for married people who read it, but maybe that's not how it came off. I don't know.
Yeah, I didn't get that vibe, but I could see the audience is a broad audience to both married and unmarried Christians.
Okay, because if it's myths, I could see where he wants to help the church to think, oh, all these singles' lives are so much easier because I don't have 2 kids or 5 kids and a house and bills and dealing with some, whatever. But I don't know.
He talks about his own struggles with some, I'm not going to ever have any children.
Yeah.
And so how that has been a burden. And also just, it was a very personal chapter for him, you could tell. And so I guess as a person who has the gift of singleness, that this might be a personal takeaway for me. The person who has the gift of singleness that is going to live their life for the glory of the Lord, even if they're very intentional in their ministry and their calling that God has called them to, like Sam with a pastoral ministry and a writing ministry. He can do a lot of stuff because he's single. Yeah. They still have some of those same struggles.
Okay.
Whereas I see the Apostle Paul and I read through some of his kind of writings, and I just don't ever have a perception that he would have struggled with, oh, I'm never going to have any kids, or oh, I don't have a security that a family might have. Like one of the things is I live by myself, so I could die and nobody even knows it for 2 weeks or whatever. Yeah, that was one of the things that he mentioned. So anyway,
that sounds sad.
It was. That's why it was sad. And it just kind of left me a little, especially at the end of the book, more as like a downer instead of maybe being more lifted up.
Oh, I could see some people who don't understand that about a single.
And so that's where the value probably is.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if that would help. Just because maybe there's single people in your church and you've never thought of them that way. Yeah. And now maybe you as a married couple might be more intentional about including them. Yeah. I don't know. So, jump in. You were writing notes all over.
You ready for the surprise of the episode?
Go for it.
So,
surprise of the episode.
I told Tim I did not read this book. And I did not read this book because I got it on Audible for free. And I actually listened to the whole thing yesterday.
You're horrendous.
So, but here's the thing. I didn't want you to know that I'd read it because I didn't want you to filter any comments through like, well, what did Charlie think of that?
Oh, that was good.
So
Charlie.
actually,
he juked you.
I just went through the book. Whoa. And so a lot of the stuff that you commented on, I would agree with you. It's whenever you listen to a book. So I didn't read it. I listened to it. Mm-hmm. And so, and the audiobook is not narrated by himself. It's someone else. And hearing other authors who've gone through that, they don't like how a narrator doesn't catch the right tone. Mm-hmm. And so it's like that narrator's inflecting and emphasizing things that maybe aren't supposed to be. Mm-hmm. So it's like, I don't even know if I got the correct shape of what it's supposed to be like. So I need to read it.
Okay. What are your thoughts?
That myth number 2, the whole gift language, I like the simplicity of what he says, but there's a couple of points where you're like, I don't really know if that's actually from the Bible.
I think he broadens it out too much. And some people who don't have the gift of singleness are confused and think, oh, I might have it. And I'm like, no, you don't. You're just single right now. You need to make preparations in your own personal and spiritual life and physical life for marriage.
So I'll say, I think you said this at one point. I actually thought throughout the book, I thought he presented a pretty balanced approach, because there were times he was kind of working through something and I'm like, yeah, but, and then like 2 paragraphs later, he'd be like, and now here's this. And I thought he balanced himself out, specifically with the whole pastoral discussion. So it's myth 5 or 6, like it hinders ministry. As someone who was a single pastor, like what he said is spot on. It's like there were things that I could do that pastors with wives and kids could not do. Mm-hmm. However, he talks about this. He's like, but think about the pastor whose wife honorably takes some of the tasks away. Not that that's what a wife has to do, but he's like, there's a partnership. Yeah. And his illustration is, if you want to go fast, single pastor. If you want to go farther, you need a partner. And he's like, and he mentioned this really unique point of pastors in the UK that they actually give single pastors an extra like half day off throughout the work week.
Yeah.
So that they can take care of the stuff at home. And what I realized was that specifically was like, you're just busying yourself in ministry. And then you're like, oh, wait, what am I going to eat?
Yeah.
What am I going to
go grocery shopping?
Where am I going to do grocery shopping? What am I going to cook? What am I going to do the dishes? Like, oh, I don't have any clean clothes. Like, and like none of that stops for a single guy in ministry. And I found that particularly difficult. Like to like, cause you're just not, you go, you're meeting with this guy, you're going to this thing. And a lot of the events of the church are organized around like when families have time.
Right.
And so a single pastor has to accommodate the family schedule. And then like, so when does the single person get the like accommodation to like complete the tasks of everyday life? And I did find that so like that resonated with me. And that's where you guys have heard me say, I've thought really hard about if I had the opportunity to go back into pastoral ministry. While I don't think I need to be married, I see the wise practical benefit of having a partner alongside of you.
Yep.
And what he concluded on, like, does a pastor need to be married? We actually almost agree. So I've got my article, Single and Ready to Minister, pulled up.
It looks really good. Very nice.
I conclude almost the same way. So he says, Paul expects pastors to be married, but they're not required to be married. If we took that literally, they'd have to have multiple children,
Right.
Yep.
all that.
Yep.
And that's almost verbatim what my article walks through.
Yep.
But I also say a church or search committee would have a few more ways to test the quality of a married candidate. On this basis, a husband or father seeking the pastoral role might be preferred compared to a single candidate. This, however, should not bar a man from consideration. If a single pastoral candidate truly meets the character requirements of the pastoral office, he should not be overlooked on the basis of his marital status, which he and I agree. And he was a single pastor, which is cool. So I think there's good balance throughout there, but it's funny, that last myth, where I actually think, as I listened to it, I was like, if I could tell everyone in my church something about what singleness is like, I think they should read this chapter.
Yes, and just hearing it, I would agree with you.
And he highlights this point that I've lived. So he talks about, like, do you realize what it's like for a single person to go like May to September every year and go to wedding after wedding after wedding, and then you get asked at every one, well, when's you're going to be next?
Yeah.
And are you still single?
Yep.
And then what's happening as those people get married is your friends are leaving you, and he vividly describes that.
Oh yes.
And as I listened to that, I thought of all the guys that now it's like, if I really want to be in their life, I have to be in their life.
Right.
Like, and he talks about that.
He
Like,
does.
oh yeah, we're,
Come over anytime.
come over anytime. And which is translated like, we're never going to reach out to you, but you just come. And so like, he walks that line really well. And again, it's just like some of his previous points. It's anecdotal. It's not exegetical.
Right.
Sure, you don't hear Paul talking about that. But I also think just because Paul doesn't mention it doesn't mean, well, then he was never lonely. Like he never thought about not having kids. I think that would be like a huge misstep to be like, well, since Paul never wrote about these in his epistles.
It'd be an argument from silence. I recognize that.
Yeah.
But the spirit.
Just like Jesus never punched a donkey in the face, right? Which Sam talks about earlier in his book. It's like, oh, well, the Bible never says not to do that, so I can do it, right? Well, why would you punch a donkey in the face? Well, the Bible doesn't say I can't. But so I'll just say that is a real experience for singles.
Sure.
The battle there is to not be bitter and not like crawl in a hole and just wallow in pity, because you shouldn't do that. And you do have a church, and you should be active in that church. And if you want to be the person sitting at home lonely, you will be that person. If you want to be involved in people's lives and find joy and satisfaction in those relationships, you will be that person. And it's not a dichotomy of either I have to do it all or they have to do it all. I think where that chapter is really helpful is it would help people understand how to interact maybe a little bit better with single people. For example, and as I was thinking this through, I was like, does that happen to me? Or what do I think about that? And like, I'm trying to like paint the picture. And I've had it happen where it's like, there's like certain events of the calendar where it's like you're expected to be with a group of people. And then someone at church will like realize last minute, like, oh wait, what about that guy? Like, well, if you don't have anywhere else to go, we'd love to have you.
Yeah.
And they think they're being really kind, but what they're doing is like, we haven't thought of you until this moment.
Yep.
And now we feel obligated to invite you. So come, we'd love to have you. And, it's funny how that never happens on just a normal Tuesday night or some random day in the middle of the month. It's like these big moments where like, oh, I bet that guy feels lonely. And I bet he doesn't have a place to go. So for these like 3 or 4 really big events, let's invite him. but there's never an invitation to like a normal, like, hey, we're just having dinner, come over. Which when you do that, you show that it's not a real relationship. And I'm sensitive to that.
It's not that it's not a real relationship. It's just a different level of relationship than you might think
that's
it
good.
is.
That's fair.
But I would encourage church members to incorporate a single all of the time, not just on moments where you think they feel lonely and need a place to go.
Sure.
And I can count, outside of like regular church gatherings, it's very uncommon for a young married couple to be like, hey, let's invite the single person over for dinner. Because who do they invite? Oh, here's a young marrieds group. Let's invite them over. Or we have small kids. Let's invite this family with small kids. And that happens naturally because, they all play soccer together, or they're all in the same age group at church. And so that happens. And
that's good.
It does get missed at times, that it's kind of a tack on to a lot of ministries of like, well, let's make sure they have a place to go. And, so there is, I think that is a real phenomena. And that doesn't let a single person off the hook. Like, they should be involved in the lives of people in their church in a real way, just like the married people or families should be involved in the single people's lives in a real way. That being said, I think he puts it this way in that last chapter. There really isn't anything that's like by itself that's like, woe is me, this is horrible. But it's funny because Tim and I have talked about this off the air like a number of times about like dating and getting married and all that. And there's a phrase that I use that I've used to you that he actually uses too. I don't know if you caught that. But he talks about the cumulative effect of all of those little moments. Where it's not like going home and not having someone there is a problem. But when it's like day after day after day after day, year after year, it's those little mundane moments do add up. And there is a cumulative social pressure that does affect single people. And where that normally has come up for Tim and I, it's like when you ask a girl out and she says no, well, just ask another one. Well, after you've been rejected a handful of times, you kind of, it affects you. It's like, there's not a lot of, I would hope that people have an awareness of like, maybe I should like take some downtime here and really think through the approach. But, so I liked that emphasis that there isn't really something that's like wretchedly, horrendously bad about being single. But and hearing from you guys, I think it's very similar to marriage, where there's a lot of little struggles that add up over time, and they're just different. So like where you guys have to go through the bedtime routine every day, and that by itself is maybe not like really horrible, but day after day after day after day, like they don't stay in bed, they won't go to sleep, they won't be quiet. It's just the opposite. It's like, I'm by myself. It's really quiet again. Like I haven't heard from anybody. And there's the cumulative toll of that. And I actually thought that was a really unique perspective on that just like the little mundane things can like weary a couple and can weary a family. There are little mundane things that weary a single person, like eating alone, doing the dishes again and again and again by yourself, like folding your laundry, or it's like, I've heard families complain about things that I would love to have, like, and it's, you almost want to be like, maybe you shouldn't complain about that. But the shoe goes on the other foot, or it's like, I can like complain about something and you're like, that sounds great.
Some solitude?
Quiet and solitude? Are you kidding me? And so, but I actually think that's one of the best things about his book is I think he presents both sides of that with some decent balance.
So I got two thoughts. I really appreciate that. That's very helpful. I really think that you said the inviting people over at calendar events. It's interesting. I don't fault people because, here it is. It's Thanksgiving. You're like, oh, does that person have anyone to be with? And I actually think that's a godly thing. And I think you're saying that. Like, oh, but I want to care for that person. But then life is so busy that there's not the church or social cue to help remind us. And then like the other X number of days on the calendar, you're just not thinking of that person over there. Mm-hmm. But like maybe perhaps an illustration that would show that should be addressed is when it comes to family gatherings of large families where you have some siblings who are married with kids, and then you have a sibling or two who are single, they're never forgotten because they're family. You don't forget your single family members just because you're married with kids. And so as a church, it would be good to think of the singles in your church more like family members and less like the single people at the church. And maybe that illustration with what you said would be helpful because, you know, your family, you're not going to forget about or if you do, there's problems the next time it's Thanksgiving, like, man, you haven't called me at all or whatever. So that was one thought. I like that. And then the second thought is I just think that's a helpful chapter from I haven't read it. You have, but it does sound helpful because if you're going to, here's what I was going to say. If the Bible says we should bear one another's burdens. And I think what that chapter does is it helps married people to understand what the burden's like for single people. And if a married couple or a married family or married people are really serious about bearing one another's burdens, that's a really helpful chapter because that's the burden you may not think of naturally. Mm-hmm. Like what you're saying, like the shoes on the other foot, we all have different burdens. Yeah. So and
I will, if there was one thing I could let everyone in our church know. And so, and I am very thankful. I love my church. And I think every like holiday, like big thing, someone does always be like, you know, 4th of July, someone's like, Charlie, you have a place to go? You want to come here and do this? And, you know, but I will say anecdotally, it seems like the only other events that I get invited to is where it's like, well, let's try to get the single girls and single guys together so that they can maybe find each other. Yeah. And I'm searching in my mind to think like, when was the last time it was just like almost no strings attached, like not like the holiday obligation, not like the let's get a couple together, like we're matchmaking. Yeah. When was the last time, and I'll say this in this way, when was the last time you, married couple, invited a single person over to your home just so they were a part of your family on a regular busy Thursday night, you know? Mm-hmm. And I don't know the last time that someone was like, hey, Charlie, just come on over. We'd love to have you. And it wasn't like, oh, does he have a place to go? Or, oh, let's hook him up with so-and-so.
That's interesting too. Married people, I don't think should feel super guilty about that though.
No, like because they're married and have kids. They have other responsibilities. This is not a
heaping of guilt. This is hey, here's another opportunity where you could serve people.
Yeah.
And then number 2, something I'm learning from this is I think there are times I've invited single people to come at various holidays. And I've said it the way you do. And now hearing you say it, I realize I'm never going to say it again. I'm not going to say, hey, do you have anywhere to go? Do you want to come to our place? Because that sounds like I only am asking you. Like if I intentionally want you to come over because I care about you, I should, hey, we would love to have you over for Thanksgiving this year. As long as you're not busy with something else, we'd love to have you over. Would you like to come? That is a better way to communicate that I love you and care about you than, hey, if you have nowhere else to go, you can come to our place.
Yeah.
Man, hearing it from the other direction makes me think like, man, I cringe that I said that to people. So,
well, and I don't think that's wrong because I think you're right. I think it's good for a church to recognize like, oh, hey, so-and-so, like, come over. But I just think it's, you know, like why is it so important at like Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter that you really want to make sure I have a place to eat? But there's no other time of the year when you ever extended that invite to me.
And I can also see where, as a single person, man, you'd have to guard against bitterness.
Yeah.
And anger. And
to be fair, every time I get that invitation, I try to go.
That's good.
Even if like, because I want to be a part of people's lives too, and it takes 2 to tango. You know, like.
Yeah, that's a really good thing.
Because I think, like to Tim's point, I do think single people can be selfish and want to be served rather than serve. And that's going to cause just as many issues or more if you're like looking for the families with kids to like meet your needs, you know, like that's dangerous and you can't.
And I don't know. I have no one I'm thinking of.
It's an unreasonable expectation.
Yeah. There's a little bit of victimhood there. There's a little bit of, it's funny. There's a little bit of you're not being kind to me. that's actually revealing you're very selfish in that moment.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I think that there's being friendly, and then there's ways to be a good friend.
yes.
And I would say a way to be a good friend of a single is to, be intentional and careful about, like you're not trying to just get them married. There's nothing wrong with them, like to assume that every single is selfish and that's why they're single is obviously unreasonable. And so I don't think it, but I do think singles need to be admonished to be more active in the life of their church. So,
Tim, you look like you got a quote.
Is I don't know how much I like how the conversation's kind of developed, but you can read through pages 129 through 133 of Alberry's discussion on this point. And the truth of the matter is, when you have a couple that are married, they have a different level of friendship than two friends. And two friends who are both single, their relationship changes after a person gets married. And that's what is a difficult thing about singleness, which he mentions on page 129. Even when a friendship is maintained with a married friend, it often becomes lopsided. The married friend no longer needs you as much as he or she did. It's just the nature of the relationship at that point. There is a change. And so as a result, the relationship takes a more asymmetrical perspective.
Yeah.
And so he doesn't necessarily say that that's not the way. Well, he does kind of say it needs to be less asymmetrical. But at the same time, he doesn't deny that it's going to be more asymmetrical because there's somebody else that is more important in the relationship now that wasn't there before. And so as far as like sympathizing with singles, I feel more the chapter can kind of foster more of the bitterness that can struggle within a single. So I guess maybe what I would say, this would be a good chapter for married people to read.
Yeah.
But less helpful for singles.
That's exactly the point that I was making.
Okay.
I like that would be mine. I think it'd be really helpful, for that reason.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what Andy was pointing out as well.
Because I think, that sounds like a good married couples chapter. And it doesn't sound like it's against singles, but I think if you're a bitter single, do you think that would be provoking more bitterness or something like that?
So and again, I didn't read it, I listened to it. And so as I listened to that chapter, I found myself doing a couple of things. So I would kind of nod in agreement, like, yeah, okay, I get that. And then especially when he talked about that specifically, like you're so close with these people and then they get married. And I have a handful or a dozen or more of relationships that fall directly into that category, as do everybody. Married people experience the same exact thing. Like you guys, have friends as married people who your friendship is much different now that you're married and they're married. Like that is reality.
Yeah. And
so to just deny that and be bitter is the wrong response. But I do think it's helpful for maybe not I wouldn't necessarily want like the married couples that are my friends to be like, look what you've done. Like that's not the point. But I think couples in a church realizing that, this guy in his late 20s, 30s, or 40s, or this girl in her late 20s, 30s, and 40s has watched dozens of their closest friends have a completely different life and do what they should do. Go be responsible for their spouse and their kids. And then that single's in a position, well, okay, now who were my closest friends aren't anymore. And when you get married and you have kids, you have people right there that you're responsible to be with. And then there's the single who watched the friend leave maybe once, maybe dozens of times, who then still goes home and is by themselves. And I don't think that's unbearable, but just as real as the married couple who has a completely new set of needs and responsibilities, just as real as that is the single who's like, well, now who are my friends?
And they've changed.
And I think married couples in the church realizing that that's the common experience of those singles is helpful as they try to be a good friend and church member to those people. And like if I had someone trying to be my friend and it was only like, well, we're obligated to invite you like these 3 times a year, I'd be like, well, that's not a good friend. Like, why would I want to spend time with that like, Charlie, the only reason I'm inviting you over is because I'm just pretty sure you don't have anywhere else to go. Would you like to come over here? That's no friend would ever do that. So married couples, don't do that to the singles in your church. And I think that is a helpful perspective.
You should have the final word on that one, Tim. You have any more thoughts? Or
I'll let Albury have the final word, maybe.
Ooh, I like it.
So on page 132 and 133, he recounts a relationship where he had a very good relationship. As a single person, my friends are a lifeline. They're like family. They're with the ones with whom I feel most known and loved. And then, of course, they get married. And one specifically visited, he says, I recently visited a close friend, and as I was leaving, we talked about when we would next see each other. When are you free? I asked. I guess we're probably looking at 3 months' time, he said. Life was busy. I was heartbroken. 3 months' time. A bit of context. He is one of my closest friends, and he said many times that I am one of his. We've known each other for many years. In fact, few people know each other as well as we do and enjoy such openness. It's a rare gift. His home is a 75-minute drive from my home, and that's not merely down the street, admittedly. Okay, do you understand?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like they're spatially separated. He's now married, so there's a lot of factors. He's got a busy life. But it's not like we have to cross time zones to see each other. I've driven farther than that just for a good curry, which was also interesting. He would go 75 minutes just to get a good meal.
I mean, maybe for a good cup of coffee.
So continuing, 3 months seemed a very long time. Life was busy. I get that. But it wasn't that he was heading overseas or preparing to go through a major life event such as having a baby or moving to a new home. It was normal stuff making life so busy rather than anything exceptional. What hurt was that he seemed kind of fine with the 3-month interim. He said it in a somewhat apologetic tone, yet while it wasn't ideal to him, it clearly wasn't a huge problem either. It felt like he was saying he could quite easily do without me, no biggie, but I can't get by with seeing such close friends only once every 3 months. It made me realize that while my close friends feel essential to me, I might not necessarily feel essential to them. And that can really hurt. What they are to me, their families are to them. I exist much lower down their list of needs. That would be maybe a good summary of what we're trying and communicating. And I think Albury specifically in this situation realized his relationship with this friend was now at a different level. And as a single listener that's listening through this, that's what happens when people get married. He wasn't being critical of his friend, but he kind of was.
Well, I think there's...
And I don't know if that was justified.
Well, I think
because the guy's situation, and he admitted it, was very complex. And that's just the way that friendships can change after people marry. So I think there's some helpful things for us to think through to the church, to love the singles in the church, and then also for the singles to realize that relationships, even marriage, is temporary. And sometimes we have to say goodbye to those relationships that are just, they change as people move through different stages of life. And just acknowledge that that's the way things work sometimes in this world.
So then, would you rank this? Do you have a ranking, or do you want to?
Yeah, I think I'd still put it on the goodness scale. I'd say it's the best book on singleness that I've read.
Okay.
I admittedly don't know how many I've read. So I don't.
That was good.
And I should rephrase that. I've actually read several books on singleness, and they're usually by like Hannah Schermerhorn or whatever. That one was dumb.
What number would you put on that?
I would put this probably yes. I would put it at a 6.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. All right. I would put this at a 6.
So what would you put it at, Charlie?
I was thinking like a 5.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I think it is. I think it's a good book.
So it sounds like it would be a good tool to help both sides think about the other side.
Yes, I just think that his category of singleness is too broad.
Okay.
Some of the people that he considers and talks about and includes in the gift of singleness are just simply unmarried.
Okay.
And they're just not yet married.
So the big critique would be that he probably needs to narrow the gift of singleness idea and account for, like, MacArthur's point that there are selfish people out there.
And exclude them from, and then those people need to be told, you need to grow up.
Okay.
And then get married.
And then aside from that critique, sounds like pretty helpful book.
Yes.
Overall. Okay. All right.
Oh, yeah.
That was a really good discussion there. I wasn't expecting that today.
You think it'll be the only single discussion we have on this topic?
I don't know. I'll give you a point for that.
Well, why don't
just
we have
just 1 point?
Just one single point. Well, why don't we have a final thought from God's word?
Sure. So, listener, there are times where we coordinate everything in the podcast. And there are other times we just show up and we've got what we've prepared ahead of time, and it sort of dovetails. I think the last episode on friendship, that just happened to dovetail really nicely. But I wanted to talk about, I just want to have a short meditation on God's sovereignty today. And so I think it might actually dovetail really well. So when you say sovereignty, sometimes if you're either a Calvinist or an Arminian, you get your cackles up, you get kind of like ready for war. And I would just say that you can use any definition of sovereignty that you want right now. I think there's one that works way better. It may even be predestined to be better. I don't know. But I would say that sovereignty is this, that God has total control at all times. And I don't really care what side of the tulip you fall on. Sovereignty is God's in total control. Well, I want you to think about that right now, and I want you to think about your life. So we all have good days, we all have bad days. We all have days where we really palpably feel God's blessing, and then we all have days where it's just really hard. And so what's your week been like? What's your life been like? When it gets really hard, I think that sometimes it's the time when either we think about God's sovereignty the most.
Sorry, I don't understand.
Sorry, that was Siri thinking I was talking to him. So that's a horrible way to interrupt a devotional. We can think about God's sovereignty the most, or we can think about it the least. Sometimes when life gets really hard and it gets really painful, the reason we think about God's sovereignty is we are wondering why God would allow such difficulty. And then other times when it's very hard, we forget that God is in control and nothing surprises him. So as I was thinking through that, because our family's walking a very hard road, a verse that's been helpful for me is Job 121. So in Job, I want you just to think briefly about the difficulty Job goes through before he responds to God's sovereignty. In the beginning chapter of Job, he's given a glowing review biblically. He's blameless, he's upright, he fears God, he turns away from evil. May it be that if God wrote our own epitaph or our own review, that he would say those things about us. And then it shows how just absolutely prosperous Job has been. He's got all these animals. What I did is when I preached this multiple times, I add up the value of those animals today and I try to get an approximation of his wealth. And he really was super, super wealthy. Put him up at the Bezos, Gates, whoever's the wealthiest, but he's up there at the time. And he has 10 children. Now, today we think of children as a nuisance and a bother. We don't, not here on this podcast, we don't. But our culture views children as a block or a break to keep us from what we want. But that wasn't Job. He had children, and everyone would have thought this guy is the most blessed by God person. And in chapter 1, he loses all his money and he loses all his children. Now, before I get to this next thing, I think we all know what he says next, but I really want you to think, in your life, what would be equivalent to losing all your money and all your children? If you lost all your money, you'd literally have nothing. You'd be destitute. You couldn't provide for anyone you've been providing for, and the future would be totally fearful because where are you going to get your money? But harder than that would be losing children. And if you don't have children, consider losing close family members. I would think it would be very similar. Now, in those moments, the doctrine and the teaching of God's sovereignty does not stop. And Job understood that. And so in Job 121, as this has happened, he gets the news, right, one message after another, that he's lost his camels, he's lost his oxen, he's lost all basically his animals, and then finally he loses all his kids. And so it says he arose, he tore his robe, he shaved his head, he fell on the ground, and it always shocks me what it says next, and he worshiped. And he worshiped. And I would say that in our modern worship culture, the thing that would drive us to fall down and worship is probably not the worst news in the world. Especially in different parts of our Christian culture, it would be the sound and the tone and the feel of the moment. But it might even be getting exactly what we want in life. But I don't think it would be this. Not for everybody, probably for some. And then it says in verse 21, and he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. So the phrase, blessed be the name of the Lord. Believer, what are you going through? What is your life like? Is it the way you want it? Is it what you would have planned? In the midst of whatever you're going through, I would like you to ask and consider this, meditate on this. Can you say, the Lord is given, the Lord is taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord? And so that's really all I want you to think about. I'm thinking about that in my own life. I'm sure you have areas in your life you need to think about that. Can you say, blessed be the name of the Lord?
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Thinklings podcast. We would love to hear from you. If you have any feedback, suggestions, or potential topics that you'd like us to discuss, you can contact us through our email, thinklingspodcast@gmail.com. Remember, don't let this conversation end with this podcast. Read good books, talk about them with your friends, and always continue to cultivate your mind. See you next time on the Thinklings podcast. The Thinklings want to remind our listeners that the Thinklings podcast is our personal production. Our conversations, book discussions, and viewpoints may not represent the views of Faith Baptist Bible College and Theological Seminary. Any questions or feedback should be directed to us at the Thinklings podcast.